Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Peter Onen. I'm a spiritual teacher, and you can learn more about me and the services that I offer on my website at peteronen.com. And today we've got Robert Michael. He is a private counsel, authorized representative, trustee, and educator. And we're going to be talking about the concept of creditor versus debtor. First off the bat, Rob, thank you for joining us. Where can people get a hold of you, and maybe just give people a quick synopsis of kind of what you do? We gave you your private counsel, authorized representative, trustee, and educator, but can you just give us a little quick synopsis of what you do, and where can people get a hold of you?
They can get a hold of me at truthandtrust.org. That's truth, the letter N as in Nick, trust.org. You can email customer service at truthandtrust.org and you'll get a hold of me there. I basically am, well, I'm a trustee privately for several private trusts, which is really an honorable position, right? Because you got to deal with, well, trust. So I do that. I also am an authorized representative for many people disputing their unsecured debt with the bank, make sure the bank has followed the rules. So I do that. I also private counsel for friends and family and people like that who want to know, the different aspects of the law, why certain things are what they are, and what they should do as a suggestion. I'll suggest certain things to them. And then, I just educate people above and beyond that. So even that's more like a counsel type of thing too when you're educating. So that's basically what I do. And I've created my own abundance out of that.
All right, perfect. Thank you. This is following the interview we did on birth certificates and certificate of live birth, and that conversation that we had. And you brought up the concept of creditor versus debtor, or debtor. I wrote the wrong thing, so I keep saying it wrong. Okay, so from what I hear, the system structure has been reversed from the original intended purpose. I'd like to hear from you, Rob. In your opinion, what needs to change to flip the system back, and what would the system look like flipped? Let's start with, what would the system look like flipped?
Well, what the system would look like flipped is we'd actually have a medium of exchange that has actual value to it, right? So right now we have dollar bills, paper, that are promissory notes. They're Federal Reserve notes, so they don't have any value because there's no gold behind it. There's no intrinsic value. They're just essentially property of the Federal Reserve, which the Federal Reserve then charged our Treasury with, or I should say the United States Treasury with, until they bankrupted it, broke it, right? So they did that, then the banks become the owner of the country, right? So now the banks own the country, they run the country because the Treasury is always in debt to them. So they make us the debtor to pay back the percentage rate for printing all those nice little worthless paper bills. So there's no value in it. So if you flip that around and you had a system that had value in it, you would have what you had in the early 1800s, which is, and in the mid to late 1700s, which is one of the most prosperous countries on the earth, because everything comes out of it is full of value, and it was that way for quite a while until we hit the Civil War and they started really, we were bankrupt from the beginning. We were bankrupt from the Revolutionary War all the way forward. However, in that bankruptcy reorganization from the Revolutionary War, they gave us the Constitution, which is a bankruptcy charter document. People were the creditors. So the creditors were obviously funding the entire country with their labor, value. There was gold, there was silver. They didn't even have a real consistent form of money for quite some time. So gold and silver was in play. Promissory notes, dollar bills were made up. You can make one up. Anybody can make one up. It's a promise to pay. So we function that way, and we have one of the most prosperous countries in the world. So if we were to flip things around, it would very much look like that again, as far as being prosperous, and putting things of value out. So eventually, if you're doing that, let's say every country did that, and there was no bank collecting interest on lending the country money, and the country produced its own products, its own value, eventually money goes away because now it's just a medium of exchange of energy. You know, how much are you going to, you know, what are you going to give me in return for what I gave you? So if I came over and I put new tires on your car, you're obviously not a mechanic. What are you going to give me? Well, if you don't have anything that I need, like let's say you're a carpenter and I don't need my roof fixed, you know, or, you know, something fixed on my home, then how do you give me value back? Well, you'd say, okay, well, I've got this medium of exchange, let's say units. I've got 40 units here, which equals so many hours of labor. You can take these 40 units over to the grocery store and now you can buy food with it. It just becomes a medium of exchange because we don't have an equal exchange of energy for our skills, right? So that's, to me, what it would look like. If you were able to flip everything around, really pump value back into not only this country's system, but every other country, eventually money just gets washed out and you just have this medium of exchange. At that point, now you have an entire earth that's functioning for one big purpose, whatever that purpose might be, you know, evolution, to evolve, to create more and create and create and create this beautiful place to visit when your soul wants to come visit. You know, it's like a vacation for your soul, you know?
Okay, so as opposed to the current system, which is set up to, how is it set up? What is the current system?
Well, current system's a debt system. It's completely built on debt. Like I said, if you've got a bankrupt nation, then you have a medium of exchange that they're using, which is a debt note, which is a promissory note in banking law. That's a promise to pay, so that's a debt, right? So you've got the whole system set up on this debt-based fiat currency. And at the end of the day, any of the interest on that debt has to be paid. So the country itself and everyone that participates is always insolvent. We're always broke. There's no way out. There's no way out of it because they've got so much.
Who are we broke to?
We're broke to the private bankers that basically broke the country when they bought it. They bought it by saying, hey, you let us come in and print your money and we'll charge you 6% on each dollar. Okay, great. And then over time, compound interest, I mean, it's just like any credit card or anything else, you're in debt. Well, I'm in debt now. I can't pay it back. Oh, good. So we own you. So you better pay us something, because they follow banking law around the whole world, which is essentially trust law, right? So now you have an obligation. You've got to pay these banks back. So now the banks own the country. Who owns the banks? Well, there's many people that own those. You know, you've got the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, JP Morgan, you know, those types of families that they have trusts where all this money bleeds back to, and everybody's passing around with trusts and trusts and trusts that you'll never see. Even, I mean, you can start to see them if you go to the Securities and Exchange Commission and start looking at the filings of some of these banks and watch where the, you know, the money bleeds back to. You see where it goes, and all of a sudden it goes to a point where it's untraceable because it goes into a private trust that you can't look at because it's unregistered. You know, okay. So it's all trust.
So let's take a step back for a moment and let's talk about what is a creditor and what is a debtor, and how did the system change, again, from, you're saying that the system was intended to be created so that the people are creditors, correct? What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, that means that the people and their labor go into the main trust to fund, you know, the country itself for the benefit of its future, quote unquote, citizens. You know, so if you're the creditor, you're crediting the management company, which is the government, managing the affairs of the general affairs of the people. So if you had a creditor-based society and you had a government that functioned, and I wouldn't even call it a government, to me, that's just a horrible word because of its origins, but let's just use that for lack of a better word. You created a corporate entity or a body that was subservient to the creditor, and the creditor would constantly fund it to make sure that it was providing for the whole, you know? So in other words, it provided food for everyone, clean food, real food, not this garbage that they, you know, put out there today. And a lot of people say, oh, well, that's socialism. Well, it could be if you let it get out of control, but it has to be controlled by the creditors, the people who are the creditors, right? So the system was set up for the people to be the creditors, although they hoodwinked us with that whole we the people stuff. But intentionally, that's where it was headed. So the king was the creditor of his country, right? He was the king, he was the creditor, until the bank came in and did the same thing to him that they did here, but that's another story. So anyway, let's just take the king idea. So the king is responsible for all his people. Well, in this country, they reversed that. They made the people all kings, and the government was the people of the king, right? The government was the servant, just like the king has his servants. So they flipped everything around. Instead of having a king be one person, they had everybody be a king. And then they made the government as the service. So they inverted it, and that's the way it really should be.
So that's the way the system was intended and originally set up and intended to be used, the founding fathers, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You can see that in Marbury versus, I think it's Marbury versus Madison, where the court said that, you know, at the Revolution, let me think how the quote goes. At the Revolution, the sovereignty devolved on the people who have none to govern but themselves. So they're saying at the Revolution, the war, the sovereignty went from one person over to the people. So the people became sovereigns, right? Which is kind of a bad word today, in my opinion. But anyway, they became kings. So they took the role of king. So now you had thousands or millions, however many people were in the country at that time, kings instead of one.
And this happened when?
At the Revolutionary War, 1776.
Okay, and you're
when
saying,
we quote unquote won the war.
okay, and you're saying that it got flipped when?
Over time, I mean, they had the intention of flipping it even back then, but it really started to take shape around the Civil War. Because here's how it went. So we were bankrupt if you do the research and look at the money, follow the money, we were bankrupt at the Revolutionary War because we had to pay Russia and other countries to help us. We didn't win that. They make us believe that we won it with a bunch of ragtag backwoods, you know, musket bearing men and women. We didn't. We had help. You know, Russia came over to fight England, you know, so who had to pay? Where did they get paid from? You know, well, we were bankrupt because we couldn't have any money to pay the war debt. So that's when they came up with the great idea that we're going to write this constitution, which is a bankruptcy reorganization document. We're going to reorganize the bankruptcy, make everybody the creditors. Here's the document that allows the bankruptcy to function. Great. So we're off and running, right? 70 years later, when the bankruptcy should have been forgiven because debt gets forgiven every 7 years for an individual and 70 years for a country, 70 years later from 1789, when that constitution was signed into effect, or, you know, ratified, or whatever you want to call it. 70 years later, 1790, you do 70 years, it's 1860. That's the Civil War. So they had to reorganize a bankruptcy again. So they have this big war. Now you're in debt again. So because you're in debt, you're going to reorganize the bankruptcy. So they did. They reorganized it. 70 years from 1860 was the stock market crash, right? So just when we were ready to come out of bankruptcy, 70 years, the debt's forgiven. They put us in debt again. Oh, we got to redo the debt again. And that's when they took more of our liberties back. So every time they do this bankruptcy reorganization, they take more of your liberties under the guise of it's for your protection. 70 years, almost 71 years later, we're out of debt again, and they were getting ready to release us back on the gold standard from 1930. What was 70 years from that? 9/11. You know, so it's every time they reorganize a bankruptcy, that's all they're doing is reorganize to keep us in another 70 years of debt.
Okay, so with that, I want to ask you the question, what would happen if they were not reorganizing the bankruptcy?
We'd be debt free.
Okay. And what are they doing by reorganizing the debt? I don't even know if I'm using the correct terms here.
Yeah, you are. They're reorganizing the debt. They're keeping everybody under control. They're keeping everybody under their control.
So what are they doing though?
As far as,
well, what does reorganization mean in this context?
Well, once that last bankruptcy is over, okay, when they reorganize it, they're just writing more laws, they're writing more protocols to follow through with the next 70 years. That's why some great big act, well, many acts come out of Congress when this happens in the middle of the night and they're 2,000 pages long. Because they already got this all reorganized and planned out. Now they go, oh, here, sign this overnight because we're in an emergency and nobody's looking. So go ahead and sign that.
And the intention of reorganizing the debt is
to keep the slaves in line.
Okay.
Right? How do you keep the slaves from getting anywhere? You got to keep them in debt. You got to keep them slaves.
So to keep the structure flipped in the malevolent side of things, as opposed to the benevolent side of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Of how it was intended originally.
Yep. Pretty slick. These guys are, amazing thought goes into this. I mean, it's an amazing creation. It really is. And you got to give them credit, man. It is wild. It is wild.
Yeah.
There's a point in time where we're flipping all that around and we're going more towards benevolence,
Let's go back to what the system would look like, and what are your thoughts around this? Where do you see things going?
Well, they have the bill on the floor now to put us back on the gold standard, which is, why can't I remember the number of it? I think it's 5054, something like that. Anyway, there's the gold standard bills on the floor. I haven't checked it to see if they've moved it anywhere, but they're going to put us back on the gold standard. They're going to get rid of all of this at some point.
And what does that mean, putting us back on the gold standard? What does
it makes our country solvent again, so we're not subservient to the banks. So the banks won't control us anymore. See, because that's really what's happened. Everybody thinks the government runs the country, but they don't. The banks run the government, make the government look like they're the ones running the country, but they're not. It's the banks. That's why the banks come in with their lobbyists and all this crap and their attorneys, and they all work draw up these laws, and then they pay people off to sign them into legislation so they can put them into play. I mean, it's just one big controlled mechanism. The president has nothing to do with it. It's just, he's controlled. It's all big show.
How, on an individual level, can we change this for ourselves? And isn't that something that you offer at your truthandtrust.org?
Yeah, I mean, I started with grassroots only from my own experience and researching all over the past, 8 years of trying to figure this all out, trying to figure out not only how do I do it for myself, but obviously if I can do it for myself, then everybody else can do it too, right? So that was really the intention, was to create some sort of path. And I'm not the only one. There's many other people out there on the internet doing this kind of stuff. But I found my path to be through, number one, declaring my status on the public record was first. So and I've heard about declaration of status years ago, but I never realized, how to do it and what that was doing for me. So I went back through my research and realized, I need to have some sort of formal declaration of status that lets others know, the government know, that I have the intention of not being a part of that system, and that my status is of a creditor status and not a debtor. And the words creditor and debtor don't even have to be used. You're just claiming who you are above and beyond, like we talked about that entity in the last interview with birth certificate, what that creates, the debtor, right? Because the creditor's always there. We just don't have the status of creditor. So I offer people a process to go through and record a declaration of status. That doesn't automatically mean that you've got millions of dollars at your fingertips, you're the creditor, people ought to respect you. It doesn't mean that. It just means that it's a tool for you to use in any situation that is calling for you to be the debtor, so to speak. So in other words, if there was ever a court situation for myself, I don't care what the charge, or if it's civil or criminal, it doesn't matter, because they're all commercial. Everything is commercial. Even criminal crimes are now commercial. because you can't go into that court system without it being a commercial transaction. So I would bring forth my record of my declaration and then my notice to the government, done properly, that I notified you guys. You've got the wrong entity here. By my declaration, I do not agree and never have agreed. So it becomes a tool. So I create the declaration of status. People can get that from the website, and then they can do the administrative process, which is a process to notify the proper entities in the government, the custodians of the alien property, which is our property. We're the aliens to that form of government. We notify them. Now I have my solid record of evidence. So I offer that on the site, those two processes. And then I offer the business trust, where the business trust then takes the interest of that debtor and takes over the debtor. And the business trust has silver in it. So it's the surety, and it makes the debtor solvent, or it has an insurance policy on the debtor, so to speak. That's my own method. That's what I've done. If people want to do that, it's not a hard process. It just takes some know-how and knowing the details and moving through the different parts. And yes, it costs money, because everything costs money for my time and energy and what I put my neck out on the line. So people could go there and they can learn and see. I mean, if you want to move forward with it, there's documents there. There's a process that shows you what to do. I'm getting ready to add more content for education. I haven't gotten there yet, but doing that here now as we speak.
Okay, so that's kind of how an individual can fill in the blank here. That's kind of how an individual can go through this process to change their status. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, on the public record.
Okay.
They're going to change their status on the public record.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that the records in the system are changed.
Okay, so that's at an individual level. What are your ideas around mass level things being flipped?
Well, if people understood trust, which they can learn, right? I learned it, and I hope to educate people on the basics and then some of the more complex issues of trust. If people learn that, you could essentially set up your own trust, which is a country and a government for that trust all to itself. I mean, every country, every government is a trust. So if you had people that, number one, declared their status, meaning they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the banks, who is the United States, essentially, not the United States of America. It's two different places. We went over that in the last interview. You would have people functioning privately to do their own thing. So if you had a bunch of trusts set up and all those trusts got together and said, hey, we're going to join one big trust, and here's the bylaws for that trust. So the future of the beneficiaries in the future that we name in this trust, whoever they may be, I mean, you don't have to name them specifically. You can do a group of a class of people, so to speak, as the beneficiaries. You could really create a whole other free independent country, I mean, straight, Well, yeah,
that's
big.
That's big.
That's huge. That's huge. Benjamin Franklin, most people don't remember who Benjamin Franklin is or was or what he did. Now, he was a Protestant, and again, you can get into religion and all that stuff, but the bottom line is what he did was create the first real free society, which our country was then built off of his model, because he had the first free society that was fully solvent, and there was hardly a government. They hardly met. Their legislature hardly got together. There's stories you can read about when some of the officers from England came over to visit, and they went to Franklin's offices. There's dust everywhere and papers left on the floor like nobody had been there in 5 years. But as free and as loosely run as it was the most prosperous colony on the entire planet, and hardly had a government, because people were free to create and do what they wanted to do. And even back then, people were walking around back then naked, right? That's what you talked about, Franklin society. That guy's crazy. His colony, people are nuts over there. They're walking around naked, because you were free to do what you want as long as you weren't harming anybody. So then they built the whole country off of that, or that premise, but they obviously, were like, oh, we're not going to go that free. you know, for whatever reason. So all that potential is still there. It's just a matter of who's controlling what, who's defining who, right? There's a group that is defining all of this over the entire planet. And if you can start in one country, and which we're the only country that can do it, because the way our bylaws are written, the other countries can't do it. You know, we can do it. Then if it spreads out to other countries from there, somehow tying into our trusts, that to me is how it would work. You get into the law of nations, you know, Vital, you get into Vital's law of nations at that point. So it's possible. In my opinion, it's possible, you know, but I'm a big thinker. I'm a big, you know, so I tend to go global.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think we did a good job with this one. I think we followed a path that was a little windy. However, it makes sense at the end, I feel, anyway. Okay, so is there any last words you want to talk about real quick about the topic of creditor versus debtor?
Just that people should really educate themselves and buy a law dictionary so they can read, and even a banking dictionary so they can read what these terms actually mean. You know, yeah, we think of debtor and creditor, it's very simple and clear cut, but what is a debt? You know, what really makes a debt? You ask people that, they don't even know. Well, I borrowed money from somebody. Okay, now you've got another term you introduced. You said you borrowed money. Well, what is money? Oh, well, it's these dollar bills, or I got credit. Well, credit's not money, and dollar bills aren't money, you know, because under banking law, if you look in the dictionary, the law dictionary of a note, it's not money. It's a promise to pay. So now you're introducing another term that you have to go to the law dictionary and see what I mean? It's all words. It's all this defining. So my last words on all this would be to educate yourself, buy yourself a law dictionary, buy yourself a banking dictionary. Because once you learn the terms and you know the language, now you can see the reversal in everything and how they flip everything around because you think the word means one thing, but really it means something completely different. So,
all right. So thank you for that. I feel like what you're really saying here is that we have a lot more options available to us than any of us realize. And
yes,
that's really the whole point of why we're getting this information out there into the world.
Yeah.
And why we do what we do. So again, Robert Michael, you can find him and his work and what he offers at truthandtrust.org, truthandtrust.org. And do you have anything else you want to say? Otherwise,
Facebook too. They can find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook group, Truth and Trust, with "and" spelled out, A-N-D, Truth and Trust.
All right.
And you'll see it's the Truth and Trust group, and there's a Merkaba on there. It's a like reddish, orangey flower of life Merkaba. That's how you know you got the right group. So they can always stop by there too.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Rob, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Peter.